This is something scary that happened to me on New Year's Eve of 2013. That night, I accompanied a few friends to a restaurant club downtown for a New Year's party. I'd been feeling a little under the weather all day, but met them at the club regardless. Around 15 till midnight, I couldn't kid myself any longer and let them all know I was heading home. The parking lot was very dark, so I pulled a small flashlight I carried with me out of my pocket and used it to light my path. As I turned the corner of the building, I caught notice of a noise off to my left between two parked cars. When I reached the area, I shone my light onto the location of the noise and saw a man crouched over on the ground. I asked him if he needed help with something, partly from my suspicion, and he said yes. He claimed he had dropped his keys and couldn't find them in the dark, and asked if I could shine my light over to where he was to help find them. Everything about the situation seemed legit, so I put my fears aside and began helping him. I crouched down next to him while we searched the area under the car. A few minutes passed, and we were still unable to locate the keys. Switching places with the man, I aimed the beam further up and under the next car. Doing this caused me to lean down further than I had to at that point. This is when I felt a hard crack against the back of my head. I remember the feeling of my face hitting the pavement, but that was all for a moment. I was probably only unconscious for a few seconds because I began waking up while I was being flipped over on my back. When my eyes opened, I saw a guy I didn't recognize going through my pockets. He had just pulled my wallet out of my back pocket and handed it over to the other guy, the one I had been helping. Then I watched as he pulled my pocket knife out from my front right pocket and flicked it open. It had one of those assisted openings on it to make it flick open real fast like a switchblade. He began waving it around in my face and asked me what my plans were for it. It wasn't a big knife or anything. The blade was maybe 3 inches long, and I carried it to use as a daily tool, like opening boxes at work and stuff like that. I never viewed it as a real weapon until that moment. It wasn't big, but it was sharp enough to cut my throat. I couldn't say anything back to him. Even though now I was fully conscious, I was too afraid to do anything. He continued waving it around and laughing. Fortunately for me, a group of men and women had just arrived and noticed what was going on. One of the men yelled out, "Hey, what are you dudes doing to him?" They must have been afraid of the number of people in the group and ran off down the street. A couple of the guys checked me out to make sure I was okay while the others called 911. The first responders arrived a few minutes later, and I went to the ER in the meat wagon. I was happy to hear I only had a slight concussion and would be allowed to go home later that morning. A female in the group had been kind enough to go into the club and tell my friends what had occurred, and they arrived soon after I did. They cut me loose with nothing more than a headache. A few hours later, and I got a ride home with one of my friends. I spoke to the police briefly that night to give them a report, but it wasn't until the following day when I got any information. My knife had been found across the parking lot from where I had been assaulted, but I never got it back because it was evidence in an open investigation. They had also found my wallet down the street from the club, but nothing was in it. The iPhone I was carrying at the time never surfaced, but I had insurance on it and got another a few days later. I still have no idea where the flashlight went to. The 2 guys that assaulted me still haven't been found, and I don't expect they ever will be. The incident had me pretty messed up for a few years, but I eventually realized I was still alive, and that was the most important thing. Despite this, I'll probably never be able to come to the assistance of another person I don't know without being very afraid. Just to be safe, I think I'll mind my own business from now on. Better safe than sorry, you know. At the time I experienced this, I was in the depths of addiction and severe depression. Just a few years before, I was on the path to starting a family and a flourishing business. Then, like a slap from God, my fiancée, who was 3 months pregnant at the time, had a miscarriage and lost her first child. I was naturally distraught, but she was beyond destroyed. It didn't take long before she informed me that the marriage was called off and she was leaving. I could have fought for her, but honestly, I had lost my motivation to continue in the relationship myself. Although I was already a bit of a partier prior to this, I dropped full bore into booze and drugs. All this wasn't coming from a desire to have a good time. I don't believe I wanted to live anymore, but I was too much of a coward to do it the quick way. I was living in a bad part of town, in an apartment complex riddled with crime. It made scoring drugs convenient, but had I still been living my prior life, there was no way I would have gone near the place. The neighbors usually stayed to themselves and minded their own business. However, I had just had a new neighbor move into the apartment above me, and he was a real pain. He would play his music from 6 a.m. to after midnight every day with the volume all the way up to 11. I had thought at first if I slept with earplugs I'd be okay, but I could still feel the bass rumbling through the bed. I did best I could to deal with it until we had a party on New Year's. The stereo didn't turn out to be the problem this night. It was his guess. Once the sun went down, they started setting off fireworks and breaking beer bottles on the sidewalk in front of my apartment. I put up with this for as long as possible, but at 1 a.m., this was all still going on. I'd finally had enough and went upstairs to talk to the resident. It took a few minutes to get him to answer the door, but when he finally did, I got attitude right off. All I asked of him was to tell his guest to stop setting off fireworks and breaking bottles, especially right in front of the apartment. And I was very kind while doing it. You'd think I called his mother a bad name, judging from his reaction. He started cussing at me, telling me to mind my own business. After this, I was done being nice and repaid with my own cussing. Within a minute, he lunged for me and I defended myself by grabbing his throat. One of his friends jumped in between us and tried to break us apart. During the struggle, my neighbor pulled a gun from his pants and actually started firing at me. This caused his friend to push back even harder on him, and our grips broke away from each other as a result. It took me a second to realize he was shooting, but when I did, I ran down the stairs for the safety of my place. Not until I got into my apartment and locked the door behind me did I notice I'd been hit. One shot had hit me just under my right breast, and another had grazed my right arm. I stumbled to my kitchen and grabbed my phone to dial 911. Talking to the dispatcher was difficult because it had become very hard to breathe. The more blood I lost, the weaker I became, until I collapsed on the floor. I dropped the phone when I did, but didn't have the energy to pick it back up. As I laid there fighting for every breath, I realized I didn't really want to die. The fear I was feeling was a wake-up call. I vowed to God that if He let me live, I was going to make up for every minute I'd wasted feeling sorry for myself. The cops had to knock down the door to get to me. That's about all I remember for the remainder of that night. I discovered later that night my neighbor had fled after the shooting, but the cops had caught up with him a couple of blocks away. The idiot tried to shoot it out with them, and actually lost his life because of it. It's the best result as far as I'm concerned. I didn't have a trial to worry about, and he didn't get to suck off the taxpayers for the next 50 years. I lost consciousness soon after the paramedics started working on me and wouldn't wake up for several hours after that. The graze to my arm was no big deal. However, the shot to my chest had collapsed my lung and almost caused me to bleed to death. It took the surgeons over an hour to stop all the bleeding, and even then, I was still in critical condition for a few days. I was finally moved to a regular room on the 5th and stayed there for 4 more days before I was released. The healing process was long and painful. Fortunately, I was lucky enough to have parents that hadn't yet given up on me, and I stayed with them during my recovery. Once my body was well on the way to healing, I had to work on my soul. I began going to NA and AA meetings as often as possible and worked hard to get past all the roadblocks that I had put in front of me. After a year or so of sobriety, I began helping others on a volunteer basis at first, but Eventually, I began working at an inpatient rehab facility. During this journey, I met a very wonderful lady. She's a nurse, and we currently are in the process of planning our wedding that should take place this June. Although I still have a long road ahead of me if I want to become a better man, I thank God every day for giving me the chance to be here, and I promise myself, him, and everyone that I will continue to work my hardest to fulfill the vow I made to him that night. One little phone call can change a life. But for Karen Faulkner, 3 phone calls would change her life in ways she will never, ever forget. 2 of the 3 were made within just a couple of hours of each other on the 1st of January 1993. The first was from her mother, informing her that her older sister had gone missing after celebrating at a New Year's Eve party. The second was even worse news. The call came from her father, telling her a body had been found. Karen's sister Kimberly had been murdered. Over the next 18 years, Karen and the Faulkner family had grieved, come to terms with their loss, and eventually put it behind. Until one fateful day, when the phone rang again. The story of Kimberly Dean Duncan's murder is as random as it is horrific. She was a young woman, just 30 years of age, and was married with 2 young children in Aloha, Northeast Portland. She and her husband had been invited to a New Year's party. However, Duncan went alone because her husband had picked up a back injury and was immobilized with extreme pain. But as the night crawled into the wee hours of the following morning, Kimberly had failed to arrive long after she was due to arrive home. Naturally, her husband began to grow irritated. It wasn't unusual for her to be a little late home due to the drunken revelry, but after hours and hours of an unexplained absence, her husband went from irritable to downright worried. He grabbed his cell phone and began to call a few mutual friends who he knew would also be at the party. Eventually one answered, but his questions on his wife's whereabouts were met with confusion. She had left the party hours before, sober as a judge, in order to get home for the time she promised. Meanwhile, a stationary vehicle was spotted by a member of the public, parked in a neighborhood not too far from where Kim had been attending the New Year's Eve party. Initially, the person who spotted it guessed that the figure that lay motionless behind the steering wheel was just too drunk to drive and decided to sleep it off. But when the car was still there the following morning, they called the police. When the cops arrived, they discovered the slumped figure was dead. They had been shot once in the head at close range. Officers fished around the vehicle for some form of ID. When they found some, the name on the card was Kimberly Jean Duncan. After an impromptu autopsy, Karen Faulkner learned that her recently deceased sister had traces of narcotics in her bloodstream. This led local police to theorize that she could have been involved with violent drug dealers. That fact left Karen highly conflicted, given that Kim had dabbled with drugs in high school, even struggled with addiction at one point, but had recently been telling her family she was clean and sober. But despite her troubled past, Karen figured the best way to honor her sister and to keep her memory alive would be to figure out what happened to her, and more importantly, who killed her. But when she called the cold case homicide unit to find out where the case stood, she discovered they had absolutely nothing. They also had a caseload of 273 investigations with just 3 full-time detectives. Karen could do the math. They were hideously overloaded with work. Months later, Karen called again. Same status. She called again. Within the unit, she became known as a bit of a pest. On one call, she reached a detective newly assigned to cold cases. He told Karen to call whenever she wanted, and he'd keep her informed of any developments. This kind of personal touch meant a lot to her. Her sister had been a living, breathing person, not an item that had been stolen or a piece of property that had been damaged. It was during one of these conversations with the new officer that she learned about a certain deck of playing cards. The unit sergeant had just come back from a national police convention where he'd learned that some police agencies were using the cards to solve cold case murders. Each card featured the victim's face, some details, and a number to call. The cards were distributed to jails and prisons with the hopes that an inmate might remember something. Faulkner made it her mission to get her sister's case on one of the 52 cards. She called, and she pestered, and she called again. When the first deck of cards was placed in Oregon's institutions, Duncan's case was featured on the 10 of diamonds. 2 years later, an inmate was playing cards in an Oregon penitentiary, held the 10 of diamonds in his hands. He read about the case, and by pure coincidence, something about it sounded strangely familiar to him. If he could provide the authorities with pertinent information, it could be a bargaining chip on his case. Authorities agreed to work with him. On pretense, they moved the man to a hospital, had him wear an undercover wire, and listened as he called his old friend to come see him. In the hospital room, he got his friend to talk about the case. Days later, authorities made an arrest. That's when Karen Faulkner received the third phone call. On the 15th of June 2010, Karen was driving on the freeway when her cell phone rang. The cold case detective told her to get her family together and come right away. "We walked into a room and everyone was standing and waiting for us," she said. The original detective who had worked the case was retired, but he was there. He had tears in his eyes. The family was told that at 8:20 a.m. that very morning, authorities had arrested Brad Richard Ballantine, 37, in connection with the murder. More than a year later, on Thursday, July 7th, Ballantine pled guilty. The family knew who, but not why. Before sentencing, Ballantine agreed to meet with the family in a jury room on the 5th floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse. "After all these years, we had the chance to confront him," Faulkner said. "He'd said he'd seen my sister at the store when she was leaving after getting some cigarettes. She pulled something out of her pocket, and some money fell to the ground. He wanted to rob her. Brad Ballantine wanted to get her out of sight, so he flirted with her and asked her to get in her car and follow him up the street. She was probably drunk," Faulkner said. "So she did." Ballantine parked his car in front of hers. He came back to Duncan's car. "He said she got mad," Faulkner related. "I think she must have realized something was wrong. He said she was disrespectful. He walked back to his car and got a gun. He came back and shot her. He fled with $68. "I'll tell you what I'll never forget," Faulkner said. "He told us she never saw it coming." Karen's father died a year later. Her mother is still alive. "I wanted my parents to know what happened to their daughter," Karen had said. "I wanted them to know the killer had been caught." "She'd be proud of me," Faulkner said, admitting she still thinks of her sister often. "She would have been as tenacious as I was had it been the other way around." This was New Year's Eve of 1994. I was a senior in high school, and my friends and I would party hop from one to another every weekend. We were in a hurry to get to a certain keg party before all the beer ran out. We'd already been drinking for the last hour since we found a homeless guy to buy us a case of beer. This was the way we usually got our booze. It wasn't hard to find some street guy happy to get a free bottle for himself. The case was quickly running out, and we were all eager to keep our buzzes going. It was about an hour before midnight, and we were still a good 2 miles away from the party. My friend, who was driving, decided to take a shortcut through the downtown area of our city. Downtown was usually dead this time of the night, and this night was no different. We were stopped at a red light a few blocks away from another where a Mustang and a motorcycle were waiting for the light to change. Their light changed the same time as ours, and we could tell the Mustang and motorcycle were racing each other to the next light, which was about 100 yards away. They were running head-to-head at first, but the bike quickly pulled in front. And what I can only assume was showing off, the guy on the bike popped a wheelie, while continuing to pull ahead of the Mustang all the time. I can't say I was impressed by this whole clown show, but we drove slowly and hung back, watching it all unfold. The bike was about 3 car lengths ahead when he lowered back to 2 wheels and lost control soon after, swerving to the left and into the path of the Mustang. The driver of the Mustang had no chance of stopping in time and collided with and rolled over the bike and its rider. If I had to guess, I'd say the car was going around 85 miles an hour at the moment of the crash. My friends slammed on the brakes in time for us to watch the rider being spit out from the rear of the car. The motorcycle had somehow flipped over the hood of the car and buried itself in the windshield. Both drivers were more than likely killed instantly. The Mustang quickly lost speed and slowly rolled to a stop against the left-hand curb. No one in the car said a word. We were so shocked, and all we could do was watch the scene, waiting and hoping someone would move, but nothing happened. After sitting in silence for several minutes, I quietly leaned forward in my seat and told my friend to take me home. He didn't speak or face me. He simply put the car into gear and made a right turn. What happened after I was dropped off, I don't know. I can say for myself, witnessing that caused a large shift in the way I lived my life from then on. Some people may ask why we didn't try to render aid to those 2 men. They do have a good argument, but I can only say that I, personally, was far too freaked out to help anyone. Because of this, I wanted to be anywhere other than there with those 2 people. When my friends and I spoke about the incident a few days later, it never entered the conversation. It was all just a given in our minds that they were both dead. According to the news the following day, our assumptions were correct. Both men had died instantly. The driver of the Mustang, a 19-year-old kid, was almost beheaded by the impact of the motorcycle. That night marked the end of my careless drinking and partying. After we returned to school, I began focusing on my schoolwork and impending graduation. A couple of the other guys carried on as usual, and their lives ended in varying levels of disappointment and loss. Focusing on my future paid off greatly, and that was only because of how I altered the way I was living my life and my priorities. In spite of the tragedy that occurred that night, it showed me in clear detail how living your life in such a reckless way could end so badly. Continuing on the path I was on, I feel, really would have meant those young men lost their lives for nothing, and that is truly the tragedy. A close friend of mine was the victim of a horrible crime a few New Year's Eves ago. Normally she would go out with me and some of our other friends to welcome in the new year, but that year she accepted an invitation to another party from one of the girls she worked with. I was a little concerned when she told me about this because she had a tendency to drink too much and lose control. She told me not to worry about her since she would be accompanied by her new boyfriend. This assertion didn't make me feel any better. There was always something about the dude that made me uneasy, but I kept my concerns about him to myself. I think to make me feel better, she promised to call me when she made it home from the party, and I happily agreed. My other 2 friends joined me at the home of another friend who held yearly New Year's parties. It turned out to be a well-planned and fun event, as it usually was, but I found myself unable to fully enjoy it, because my other friend's welfare was always lingering in the back of my mind. I was continually checking my watch throughout the night, waiting anxiously for a call. Around 2 a.m. when I got in my door, I expected her call to arrive at any moment. After I grabbed a small bottle of Gatorade, my personal favorite hangover preventative, I curled up on the couch and prepared myself. Around 4:15 that morning, I was awakened by my phone. I was still on the couch where I parked a few hours before and must have dozed off waiting. Drowsily, I answered the phone by lightly scolding her for waiting so long to contact me. However, the voice that greeted me on the phone was not my friend's. Instead, I was told that my friend had been dropped off at the ER for what turned out to be alcohol poisoning. I quickly thanked the lady for contacting me and ran out the door for my car. When I arrived, the nurses and doctors were still working on her. One of them took me aside. That was when I learned just how she had arrived at the hospital. From what the staff could tell, she had been driven there and dumped out in front of the ER's automatic doors. One of them noticed the doors opening and closing over and over, and when they went to see what was wrong, they found her unconscious body laid there on the ground. My mind was overflowing with questions and curses, but she wasn't finished giving me the bad news. A member of the team working on her found a pair of what she assumed to be her own panties in the front pocket of her skirt. The underwear were ripped and torn like they had been yanked from her body. Since she was now very suspicious that my friend had been assaulted, she examined her closer and found bruising and blood in her private area. The police were notified, and they used a kit to investigate further. During the procedure, male fluids were discovered. For a moment, I was about to ask her why she was telling me this. Surely there was privacy laws in place, but then I remembered that I was listed as her next of kin. All the blood members of her family had died in the Balkans War of the 1990s. As if she could read my thoughts, she said that she wouldn't normally tell another person a patient's private information, but under the circumstances it seemed necessary. I was confused by the word circumstances and asked what she meant. She then told me that my friend's condition was very serious and she might not live. The words "may not live" gutted me, and I collapsed to the floor and began bawling my eyes out. The nurse helped me up and led me into a private area so I could get myself together. The time eventually came when there was nothing more the staff could do for her, and she remained in a coma for several days. When the time came for her to pass, I was with her, and it didn't appear she suffered. By this time, I'd come to the conclusion that her death was probably for the better. I don't think she would have been able to deal with the news of her assault. Things had a way of eating at her that I don't think it would have on anyone else I knew. It likely went back to her childhood in Bosnia, and I think some things happened that she didn't talk about and led to her issues with alcohol. Although I'd come to terms with her death, I still wanted some answers. I tracked down her so-called boyfriend, the a-hole that went with her to the party. He acted as if though her death was no big deal, which made me even angrier. I did all I could do to control myself while I spoke to him. When it came to the question of why he left her at the party, he said she was acting kind of like a hoe. This was the last straw, and I slapped him as hard as I could. The look of shock on his face made me chuckle, but after that I was asked to leave by his boss. My next goal was to track down the guy, or the guys that assaulted her. I had tried to get in contact with the police to get some information as to if they were pursuing the investigation, but I continually got the runaround. One officer even told me that any charges were unlikely because of her death. Whether they were going to do anything or not, I was determined to track down that person. 3 years have passed since her death, and I'm still no closer to finding him. I've talked to several party attendees and come up with very little. However, as long as I'm physically able, I'm going to continue my search. As far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't be a real friend if I didn't. It's not common that a story begins with a police officer robbing a gas station at knife point, but not all stories are created equal. And so, a tragic chain of events led the former police officer boyfriend of Nicola Dixon to stick up a patrol station cashier with a bladed weapon more than 3 years after she was murdered. James Winfield had been seeing the murdered schoolgirl for most of 1996, but the couple broke up just before she was killed on New Year's Eve. What became clear over the following years was that her death had a terrible, traumatizing effect on him. When he was convicted of robbery in 1999, the court heard how he threatened a terrified assistant with wearing a balaclava mask and brandishing a jagged-edged knife because he was depressed by her death. James Winfield pled guilty to robbery and was given a 2-year prison sentence, suspended for 2 years. At Birmingham Crown Court, Judge Lawrence Marshall said there was absolutely no doubt that the effect that Nicola's death had on Winfield had been an overwhelming factor in his motives for committing the violent robbery. He told him, "Nicola's death was a most horrific event, and prior to her brutal murder, you had lived an exceptional life and had a rosy future." Ex-grammar school pupil Winfield was considered a star pupil at school and represented his county at rugby and swimming. Judge Marshall said that at the time of the offense, Winfield was in a highly vulnerable state and was undergoing psychiatric counseling. Chris Millington, Winfield's defense attorney, told the court that Winfield and Nicholas started dating early in 1996, but by the end of the year he had ended the relationship, yet the pair had remained close friends. The defense attorney also said that Winfield was not 17-year-old Nicola's boyfriend at the time of her murder in the grounds of Holy Trinity Church in Sutton Coldfield on New Year's Eve 1996. But he said the killing had a profound effect on Winfield, particularly as it happened only a few hundred yards from where he was at the time. He was utterly devastated by it. Although he had broken off their relationship by that time, he still felt a sense of responsibility for Nicola. Winfield was later interviewed 4 times by murder squad detectives, and this too had caused him great stress. He was always protective of Nicola, and the idea that he was an actual suspect in her murder was psychologically devastating to him. He was later eliminated from inquiries following the results of DNA tests, but by this time he had fallen into acute depression and had started to drink heavily in an attempt to escape the feelings of shame and guilt. In June 1998, Winfield resigned from the police force and got a job as an assistant manager in a pub, something that may well have contributed to his alcoholism. At the time of the gas station robbery, Winfield was suffering mental illness and was desperate to repay a debt to his mother. Prosecutor Stephen Bailey said Winfield lunged at the young cashier when he tried to press a panic button. He grabbed just over 100 pounds from a till and ran off, but was found by police a short time later hiding in bushes nearby. The cashier was shocked but otherwise unhurt. The man who ended up being charged with the murder of Nicola Dixon was actually the best friend of one of Nicola's former boyfriends, who has still been living in Australia until just before Nicola's murder. Colin Waite was arrested shortly after returning to the UK. Both James Winfield and Colin Waite were understood to have been questioned regarding the murder shortly after it had taken place. Waite later left Britain for Australia but returned to the UK not long after, where it is understood there was an outstanding warrant for his arrest. This may explain why police, who have been repeatedly questioned over their inability to solve the high-profile murder, have always been confident that they would ultimately charge someone with Nicola's murder. Now a DNA breakthrough is believed to have provided fresh evidence in the case, which sparked one of the biggest manhunts in the history of West Midlands police. Nicola, an art and photography student, had been walking alone to a party when she was attacked. Her naked and bruised corpse had been found on the church grounds the following morning. An inquest heard that the A-level pupil had been assaulted but had died from severe head injuries. Detectives have since recorded almost 3,000 statements and have taken DNA samples from more than 9,000 men. But despite the huge police operation, which has involved hundreds of officers and detectives, as well as a £20,000 reward being posted, no one was charged until long after the murder. Waite was arrested by detectives from West Midlands Police. He was later questioned at Bloxwich Police Station, where a police source said he was arrested sometime earlier on an unrelated matter and a DNA swab was taken. It was checked against samples taken from Nicola Dixon's murder scene. At what is believed to be Waite's family's home in Highgate, Birmingham, a Jamaican woman refused to discuss the arrest last night and threatened to call police to our reporter. "Go away, I have nothing to say," she is reported to have said. Neighbors said they knew very little about the Waite family. One stated that a couple in their 60s live in the house and they have a number of grown-up children. "We say hello whenever we see each other, but apart from that, I don't know a lot about them." Detective Superintendent Matt Sowers said the arrest was a result of an intelligence breakthrough from forensic processes. On the night she died, Nicola, who studied at Fairfax School in Sutton Coldfield, had set out to walk half a mile from a hospital social club to meet friends at a pub party. Her killer struck as she took a shortcut down an alleyway near the church, and she never arrived at the pub. She had stayed at home in Corncrake Close, Sutton Coldfield, over the festive period to take her driving test on New Year's Eve, while the rest of her family traveled to visit relatives in Northumberland. The test was cancelled because of snow. Close to the anniversary of the murder last year, her father Andy said police had strong DNA evidence that could eventually catch her murderer. He added, if the killer commits another crime, then he will end up behind bars. West Midlands Police had also disclosed that they monitored the national DNA database for comparisons between samples from the murder scene. Nicola Dixon's father, a 51-year-old civil engineer, had said, "My wife Rita and I are always hopeful that one day this man will be caught. We feel that someone, somewhere, must know something about the murder or at least have a suspicion about a particular person. Even after all this time, it is not too late." Last night, the couple, who had been kept closely informed of the latest developments, said they would not be commenting on the arrest. Waite, a vehicle examiner for a credit company and a father of 4 from Highgate, Birmingham, denied the murder, claiming he spent the night with his girlfriend and brother in Birmingham. After the verdict, he was handed a life sentence. He protested his innocence, and his brother, after shouting abuse at the jury, attacked photographers with a walking stick. It seems Waite was born into a violent family, and, in the end, it was his violent nature that would consume his life, as well as Nicola's. If you've ever wondered what happens to the bullets when some idiot shoots a gun straight up into the air, I can tell you. They kill people. I met up with a group of friends at a small field on the edge of town my junior year in high school. Since we were still too young to drink, this was how we usually celebrated the holiday. We were planning on setting off some fireworks at midnight, but couldn't do it in town because of some law forbidding it. A few of us had some left over from the 4th of July, bottle rockets, sparklers, Roman candles, that kind of stuff. I'd arrived at the field around the same time as the others, which was about 11:30. Someone had brought a little fold-out table, and we all sat down and picked through the bag of fireworks. We divided them equally among each other, and we sat around and talked until it was time to set them off. It was a beautiful and unseasonably warm night. There was very little light pollution because we were up on a hill and looking down on the town. When the time came, we counted down to midnight and fired off our Roman candles together in a line. Off in the distance, you could hear and see other people setting off their fireworks. Some lasted for several minutes before burning out. After 15 or so minutes, some of us were getting low on what we had, and a few had already run out and were sitting back at the table talking. I remember I was standing off in the distance where we were shooting the fireworks, BSing with another guy, Tyler, and out of nowhere, he dropped to the ground. He was known to be somewhat of a joker, so I just laughed and told him to get up. I said it one more time, but he still didn't move. Since I don't handle that kind of behavior well, I got mad and started yelling at him. I was seconds away from kicking him until I noticed he wasn't breathing. When I ran up to him, I saw something wet looking on his head. I touched and rubbed it between my fingers before I realized what it probably was. I flicked on my lighter and could see that it was obviously blood. Trying not to panic, I took a deep breath and called 911. I knew one of my friends had taken a CPR course, so I yelled at her to come help. My other friends initially thought Tyler and I were trying to prank them, just as I had, but when I started cussing at them, which I almost never do, they knew something was seriously wrong. While I talked to the dispatcher, Katie, the girl who knew CPR, worked to get Tyler breathing. The ambulance had little trouble finding us, but eventually after 20 minutes they did. When they arrived, he still wasn't breathing. The paramedics continued working on him during the ride to the hospital, but he never regained a pulse. The doctors declared him dead just after 1 a.m. Now, with his death, the questions about how he died were being asked. It wasn't until we got to the ER that we discovered he had been shot. This freaked me out because I knew I didn't shoot him and no one else present could have. The cops didn't appear to believe us until they spoke to the doctor and were told the wound was very likely due to a stray bullet. They still continued questioning us to make sure our stories lined up, but once they were satisfied we weren't hiding anything, they told us how it probably occurred. In certain communities, people fire their guns into the air to celebrate, similar to the way you see cowboys do in movies. This is done most often on the 4th of July or New Year's. What they don't take into account is that the bullet has to come down somewhere. They were almost positive at that point that was what happened to Tyler. I wasn't aware anything like that happened these days. Then again, I don't know much about guns. How someone could do something so reckless makes me distrust gun owners even more. Some of those fireworks we'd been hearing were probably people shooting guns in the air. The officers were painfully honest in telling us that the odds of ever finding the person who fired that specific bullet were very low. Hearing this just made me sadder. As the months, then years, passed and no arrest was made, I had to accept that the officers were right. 15 years have passed since Tyler's death, and every holiday I hear more and more stories about people losing their lives in the same manner. Something so preventable shouldn't continue to go on. Every time I meet a gun owner, I tell them this story and remind them that every bullet they shoot hits something. Just because they don't see it or hear it hit does not mean it never lands. If you know someone who celebrates in this way, share this with them and remind them what goes up must come down. You may save a person's life doing so. I'm a 23-year-old female currently living in the Midwest. For the sake of the story, we'll say my name is Paula. It was my grandmother's name. 2 New Years ago, I came very close to being a victim of assault. I had been invited to a party that was being held by a friend of my older brother. Since it was a last-minute thing and I couldn't find a date to go with me, I was reluctant to go, but after a lot of nagging from the same brother, I agreed. My only condition was that he accompany me instead. I made it clear that I did not go to places where alcohol was being served without a male escort. This was because of things I had witnessed in college happen to a few of my female friends. I didn't tell him this, but I think he caught on. Obviously, I didn't want it to be a date. I simply felt more comfortable having a male to watch my back. He finally agreed and picked me up the following week at around 8:30 p.m. There were a couple of people I knew at the party, so I stayed with them as much as I could. Only one of them was a girl, though, and her conversational skills, beyond shoes and reality TV, weren't very strong. Before we arrived, I made my brother promise to stay within sight of me so I could wave him down if I wanted to leave or I needed him. After whining for a few minutes, he promised and we headed inside. The place that they were having the party in had an open bar, so by 10:30 many of the attendees were trashed. At one of my trips to the bar, I had to put up with some slobbering pervert hitting on me, and several of my trips people repeatedly kept bumping into me. This was more than likely when I had something dropped in my drink. The rest of the night seemed pretty much a blur for me. I do remember laying on a couch in another room, but the rest of what happened had to be told to me the following day. It seems that at some point prior to midnight, I disappeared, and my brother had to come looking for me. He said that he asked several people if they had seen where I went, but no one except the girl I had been trying to talk with knew. She said when she spoke to me last, I was belligerently drunk and told her to F off, then stumbled out the room. My brother knew I never got out of control like that, so something must have been wrong. After searching a closet in the adjoining ballroom, he tried the little waiting area opposite the ballroom and found me unconscious on the couch. The scary part was that he arrived just in time to catch a guy attempting to remove my underpants. The sleazebag had my skirt hiked up and was grabbing for my panties when my brother pulled him off me. Being the protective big brother he'd always been, he proceeded to beat the guy up so bad that he lost a few teeth. Once he was done with him, he threw me over his shoulder and carried me to the car. It wasn't until the following afternoon that I could stay awake. Despite this, I was barely able to do so and felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My brother's freaked out behavior told me without saying anything that something really bad had happened the night before, and when he told me what it was, I was unable to speak. From that day on, I swore off going to parties or anywhere alcohol was being served. I tried my best to move past it, but I realized, after another unrelated incident, which I won't mention, I needed counseling. I have a way to go before I'll be able to be intimate with anyone, and I have no intention in rushing my recovery. Probably the only man I still trust is my brother. A week still doesn't go by that I don't thank him for saving me. No doubt, some people will wonder why my brother didn't take me to the hospital. What he's told me was that at the time, he wasn't sure if I'd been drugged or was just very intoxicated. He also knew that the police would be contacted, and since he had just beat my assailant almost to death, and I'm not being dramatic, he was afraid he may be charged with something. He was willing to wager that the guy wasn't going to go to the cops. After all, what was he going to say? Since we never heard from the police, I guess he was right. Now that my brother had seen what some guys will do to get what they want, he's much more understanding of my earlier fears and those of his female friends. He's become the unelected sheriff and protector of all the girls, and since he whipped that dude so badly, no more incidents such as mine have occurred anywhere he's in attendance. I couldn't be more proud of him or love him anymore. On the night of New Year's Eve 2002, Rachel Moran, a resident of the British East Coast city of Hull, was headed to a party. Like many of her peers, she intended to see out the year in style. She put on her best skirt, carefully applied her makeup, before heading on foot to the nearby celebrations at her mother's house, where her friends and family had festivities in full swing. She saw on the New Year with friends, counting the seconds until the change of year like so many others up and down the country. A few hours later, after hours of alcohol and dancing, Rachel decided to head home. But this was the final night of her short life. She would never be seen alive again. A court would later hear that Rachel was stabbed 20 times in the head and neck before her lifeless body was crammed for weeks into a tiny cupboard inside her killer's flat. The 21-year-old aspiring singer was lured to the flat of a man named Michael Little in the early hours of New Year's Day, then brutally attacked from behind, Hall Crown Court was told. The evidence obtained by various forensic pathologists showed that Michael Little had performed intimate acts with her, but disturbingly enough, it was impossible to say whether this occurred before or after she died. It is alleged he then wrapped the body in a thin bedroom curtain before concealing it in the small locked cupboard. Little, 23 of Nashcourt Hall, had pleaded not guilty to the murder of the striking 6-foot-tall blonde in the opening hours of January 2003, a crime that sparked a massive police hunt and united the city in grief when the broken body was finally found. The search for Rachel began after she failed to return to the home she shared with boyfriend Mark Shepard, following a New Year's Eve party at her mother's home in nearby Hall Road. Rachel Moran left the family home to walk back to her own apartment at around 1:40 a.m. on New Year's Day. Prosecutor Jeffrey Marson, QC, told the court that Rachel hugged her mother Wanda and told her she would call her as soon as she arrived home. Wanda Moran would not see her daughter alive again. By tragic coincidence, Michael Little was making his way home along the same route as Rachel. Sometime after about 2:20 a.m., he lured Rachel into his flat. Shortly after they arrived, he attacked her with a large knife. In a brutal attack, her killer stabbed her from behind at least 20 times to the head, back, chest, and neck. He used such force that on occasions the knife went right through her body. At some stage, the defendant had intercourse with Rachel. It is not possible to say whether that took place before or after the attack. Mr. Marson said that after Michael Little wrapped her body in the curtain and concealed it in the cupboard outside the door to his flat, he set about cleaning up the vast majority of blood using bleach and paper towels. Over the course of the next week or so, Michael Little apparently attempted to separate himself from the evidence of his crimes, disposing of various items of Rachel's personal property by throwing them into a nearby drain. Yet, as Humberside police continue to investigate Rachel's disappearance, highly trained police divers found personal items such as trainers, a handbag, passport, bra, thong, and diary in the drain. The passport was one heck of a find, and Little had made a serious mistake in disposing of it in the same manner as the other items. It clued police as to exactly who the items belonged to. As a result, they decided to search the nearby groups of houses near to Rachel's Saxe Court home, and Michael Little's nearby flat just happened to be in the designated search area. When police investigators arrived at his home, they began intensively searching his first-floor flat, but unfortunately found nothing in their initial attempts. They then asked for a key to the cupboard located near to his front door, a reasonable request, but one that raised extreme suspicion when he repeatedly claimed that he had no key to the cupboard after having accidentally misplaced it. Police were determined to search it thoroughly and eventually resorted to brute strength to tear the door from its hinges. Police on the scene would later say that they smelled a kind of rotten meat odor coming from the cupboard, and after moving various boxes, found her decomposing body hidden inside. It is thought that she had been stuffed inside the tiny cramped space for almost a month. Prosecutor Jeffrey Marson, QC, told a court that Michael Little said that the body in the cupboard was her. Martin then quoted Little's statement to the police soon after they uncovered the evidence. "I need to get off my chest. I wanted to tell somebody for so long," Michael Little is thought to have said. "I can't be normal. I must be evil. A normal person would not do that." The courtroom was shown CCTV footage of Rachel walking to her parents' home on New Year's Eve, and also of her walking home in the early hours of New Year's Day. She was heading home after speaking to her boyfriend, who was at a party on a nearby council estate. CCTV footage showed her in a leather jacket, dress, and white trainers walking past a local convenience store. The same camera picked up Michael Little walking in exactly the same direction and route as Rachel, about a minute prior to the unfortunate victim. But a CCTV camera near Rachel's home showed that by a few minutes later, Little was walking around 40 seconds behind Rachel. This was overwhelming evidence that he had followed her, maybe even stalked her for a little while before choosing his moment. Michael Little later claimed to the investigating officers that Rachel had ran up to him and asked in a friendly manner if she could walk with him, because it would make her feel safer. He then invited her to his flat just a few hundred yards from her home, where they had a drink. He is alleged to have told police that they then argued, and he backhanded her. He then claimed that she had slashed his arm with a small knife, and that what followed had been acts of self-defense on his part. Michael Little had been drinking with friends at the Good Fellowship Inn on New Year's Eve before attending a party, leaving to return home at around 1 a.m. The 16-stone defendant had drunk several pints of beer, alcopops, and even a quadruple vodka. Faint bloodstains were found in the hallway of Little's home, and zigzag patterns found by the front door matched Rachel's trainers. Little refused to answer police questions in interview. Prosecutor Jeffrey Marson QC said, "It is clear the defendant was responsible for Rachel's death and that he's guilty of murder." Michael Little showed no emotion as a jury at Hall Crown Court found him guilty of the murder of Rachel Moran in the early hours of New Year's Day. If ever there was a murderer deserving of life imprisonment, it is Michael Little. It was around noon on New Year's Eve 2014 when the staff of the Future Inns Hotel in the Welsh city of Cardiff discovered a body in room 203. The duvet had been pulled over her head, an ottoman had been pulled from its normal position, and blood-stained bedding and towels had been hidden out of sight in the bathroom. It was the body of Nadine Aburrus. The horror of the situation quickly became evident as police were called, and the investigation to find Nadine's killer quickly became an international manhunt. Almost 2 years later, American businessman Sami Al-Mari was jailed for 17 years for murdering Nadine, whom he called his ex-girlfriend. The New York City resident was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 17 years after admitting murder on the second day of his trial at Cardiff Crown Court. The court heard that shortly after committing the murder, Al-Mari left the crime scene at the Future Inns Hotel in the early hours of the morning and made his way to Heathrow Airport, before purchasing a seat on the next flight to Qatar in a bid to escape justice. The police operation that followed was one of the most complex faced by South Wales police in its entire history. But despite Al-Mari being thousands of miles away, they were to track him down to the East African nation of Tanzania before bringing him back to Wales to face the consequences of his barbaric actions. During the manhunt, investigating officer and chief negotiator Detective Chief Investigator Gareth Morgan conducted a number of conversations with Al-Mari as he attempted to remain one step ahead of the authorities. Sami Al-Mari met his victim Nadine Aburrus on the online dating site MuslimMatch.com way back in 2012. The couple quickly developed a long-distance relationship through phone calls and Skype, with Al-Mari making multiple trips to Nadine's home city of Cardiff during 2013. Nadine visited him in New York the following summer, with the tryst apparently continuing despite the strain of the long distance. However, something happened in New York City, something that has never fully come to light. But what we do know is that Nadine later told New York State Police that Al-Mari had assaulted her previously. After she returned to the UK, he continued to send her threatening text messages and emails, with one particularly disturbing message reading, "I've been calling you a lot. I will never ever stop now or give up. I will harm you." Sami Al-Mari then flew over to the UK to visit Nadine around the holiday period in 2014, apparently in some attempt at reconciliation. We will never know if Al-Mari's intentions were pure, but whatever the case, we know he was told to leave the country following a heated argument with Nadine's brother. However, instead of getting the train back to London and hopping on the next plane from Heathrow to New York, as Nadine and her family expected him to, Al-Mari booked himself into the Future Inns Hotel in Cardiff Bay. He then proceeded to call Nadine and ask her to come to the hotel, telling her he had left his passport and phone at her house and that he needed them to return so he could leave the country. Likely keen to get Al-Mari out of her hair, Nadine obliged and set off from the family home, arriving at the hotel close to 9:10 p.m. CCTV in the hotel lobby shows that Nadine immediately went to Al-Mari's room, number 203. At around 10 p.m. that night, Nadine and Al-Mari left the hotel and went by taxi to the Lilo Grill House, named after the Disney character, on City Road, Cardiff. Restaurant staff later claimed that the couple's body language was not good, and they were described as shouting and arguing. One of the staff members was later reported to have said that something wasn't right. They stayed at the restaurant for just less than an hour, and lobby CCTV has them arriving back at the Future Inns just after 11 p.m. That was the last time Nadine was seen alive. At around midnight, Almari left the room to head to the nearby Grosvenor Casino and returned shortly before 1 a.m. A few hours later, Almari left the Futures Inn motel for good. Before leaving, he approached the bar manager, Peter Morris, and asked directions to the nearest highway that would take him to the airport. He said that he had left a do not disturb sign on the door because his sister was still sleeping. At 12:20 p.m. on New Year's Eve, the duty manager entered room 203 and discovered Nadine's body. Hotel staff then called the police, who arrived and began their investigation. Detective Chief Inspector Morgan, who led the operation, told the news media, at 12:30 p.m., we received a report of a female found deceased in a room of the Future Inns, and you can imagine it wasn't clear what we were dealing with, but it became quite evident that it was a homicide. We did some inquiries and found out the room was booked by Sammy Almari, and after doing some research, we found a previous incident regarding him. There had been a bit of a link here. He had paid with his card and found out he didn't reside in the UK, and Fast Check told us he was up in the air on a flight to Qatar. It was very fast-moving. Almari had murdered a girl in Cardiff, and the next afternoon he's in Qatar and on his way to Tanzania. It's unbelievable that can happen. Investigating police then found handwritten letters in hotel room 203, which were addressed to Almari and signed with the name Nadine. But these were later determined to be penned by Almari due to the letter's use of the American system of writing dates as opposed to the regular British format. DCI Morgan added that there was a legal framework we have to deal with for an international arrest. You have to show the Crown Prosecution Service and Interpol that you have the evidence for a case to allow a red notice to be put in place to give legality to the country of jurisdiction to arrest him. We knew that wasn't going to happen in just 3 hours. We had to gather intelligence about what he was doing and where he was. While police were still trying to figure out a way to bring Almari in, things took an unexpected turn when the killer contacted the hotel from the deceased Nadine's phone and, surprisingly, actually asked to speak to the police himself. According to DCI Morgan, Almari took Nadine's phone and laptop with him. He phoned the hotel and told them they needed to look in room 203 because he was worried about his friend. He spoke to a detective and was asking if she was okay. The call became weird and a negotiator, me, was deployed. Almari lied and said he tried to help her end her own life and he didn't know she was dead. It was quite bizarre. He was concerned about her being buried. The negotiation was to secure a safe arrest and stop him from causing harm to another person. It was clear he was lying about his location. He was telling me he was in Havana, Cuba, that he would hand himself in to the authorities, but he was intoxicated and in a room with a woman. He said he was going to do the same to her as what he did to Nadine. It was high risk, and we weren't in control. We knew he was in Tanzania, but locating him with precision was difficult. The seemingly distraught Almari told police he was planning to end his own life because he couldn't bear to live without Nadine. He went on to say that when they got back to the hotel room, he was stunned when Nadine had asked him to hurt her. He went on to say that when they got back to the hotel room, he was stunned when Nadine had asked him to end her own life. Almari told police she said that she'd been waiting for the right moment to go to the Saints. I strangled her. I strangled her for more than 5 minutes. I was so scared. He later asserted to interviewing police that Nadine had tried to strangle herself, but when he left for the airport, she was definitely still breathing. He ended the conversation with the chilling statement, "I am ending my life today. I'm sorry to the family." In another call to DCI Morgan, Sammy Almari said he was going to hand himself in to the American Embassy in Puerto Rico, which he claimed was his next destination. He later said he was lying and wasn't going to hand himself in, inquiring if the British penal system included the death penalty, which it does not. He told DCI Morgan, "I want the death penalty because I want to die. I have a gun with 9 bullets and I can shoot myself. I didn't mean to kill her and I love her, but she asked me to help her die." This was the last phone call police received from Almari. The conversations were certainly strange, DCI Morgan later explained. He would go from being quite calm to irate. He was unstable for sure, but I would put that down to intoxication. I sensed he was under the influence of drink. The key was to control the evidence gathered in the UK. We looked at that and focused on the processes here. We had evidence of him coming over to the UK. He had a dispute with Nadine's brother, and he dropped his mobile phone, which we were able to find and examine. He was huge on the internet, so we gathered lots of intelligence about the background of the relationship and his possessive, jealous, coercive, and threatening behavior, and answer phone messages which were highly threatening. We had his movements and conversations. All the evidence towards the murder was developing really well. We were to get that international arrest warrant in place, but the time of year didn't help with people being on leave and having to deal with the different time frames. We had to make sure we had the resourcefulness and resilience to keep South Wales Police business as usual and to manage the investigation, especially for the hotel, and to go about our job sensitively and professionally as possible. On the 2nd of January 2015, Almari began contacting Nadine's friends and family, as well as posting on the wall of her Facebook account. Almari also sent a text message to Nadine's mother, one of which stated, "I know how you feel. Let her go. I love her too. It's your effing son." He later texted her, "I promised you, Nadine, my life. I see her soon. I can't live with this anymore. I love her." Detective Chief Inspector Morgan exclaimed how these texts complicated their investigation. This caused serious upset to people, and managing that was really difficult. It was very difficult because we couldn't control what was going on over there, but he was continuing to use her phone and we were able to identify he was in Tanzania. We went to the media, who were a great help, and we issued a press appeal. They went global and had a lot of airtime in Tanzania, which put pressure on Almari, and we started to get information. What we did was send a couple of South Wales police officers out to Tanzania. They did a sterling job. There was a lot of international pride involved. Despite their best efforts, the international police search for Almari was proving unfruitful, and Nadine's family were told they could be facing a long wait for justice. But on January 19th, 2015, Almari was suddenly located in the town of Iringa, where he had family and was detained. Less than 3 weeks after his escape from the UK, Almari's period of running from the law was finally over. But there was still an incredibly long way to go with Almari's extradition back to the UK, not taking place until the 23rd of March, almost 2 months later. Detective Chief Inspector Morgan was one of the officers dispatched to East Africa to bring Almari back to the UK and place him under arrest for Nadine's murder. He said, "When we met, he was a charming and intelligent person. He was quite manipulative. He was smartly dressed and very confident when we eventually met him, and I described him as a Walter Mitty character. He was well turned out when we met him, and that's the perception he wanted to give to Nadine and the family, someone who was a successful businessman. But I don't think that was the case. He didn't really comprehend what was going to happen. I don't know whether he thought someone was going to buy him out, but he was very chatty, friendly, and confident, until we got to the Heathrow, where he was booked into custody and charged with murder, and then we saw a real difference in him." After a series of preliminary hearings at Cardiff Crown Court, in which Almari shockingly pled not guilty to a murder he had all but admitted to, a trial date was set for the 19th of October 2016 and was due to last a number of weeks. But after the first day of the trial, when the case was opened and piles of evidence laid out, Almari changed his plea to guilty and was sentenced on November 3rd. Nadine's mother, Andrea Abora's heartbreaking victim impact statement was read to the court. "By taking Nadine, the defendant has taken the glue that made this family. We allowed him to come into our family, and instead he took from us my child. Life will never, ever be the same. No sentence that could be given to this man could compare to the sentence he has given us. He has destroyed us. After the sentencing, she read a statement outside the court thanking the police and Crown Prosecution Service for their hard work in prosecuting Almari. She added, "It is unimaginable for us as a family to understand the heinous crime that has been committed. We will continue to remember Nadine and the joy that she brought us, but our lives will never be the same." Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, 2020 gonna be lit. Tanzania.